going on, everybody? Bowen's back in the shock surplus shop to talk about more shocks, and today we're talking about two of our favorite trail-oriented setups, the OMI BP-51 and the Dobinsons MRRs. Now, what does it mean to be more trail-oriented? Well, most shocks at this particular price point, the high-end stuff, is usually optimized for higher speed off-roading. We call that race-oriented. Obviously, it's not going to be a race car when you bolt them on, but they're really tuned and optimized to push the limits when you really want to go fast. Now, these are more of a shock that is designed for how most people are using their rig. Rather than sacrifice a little comfort for more control, they're about giving you optimal comfort out on the trail at more reasonable speeds or with a little constant load. Now, Dobinsons and OME both look at upgrading your vehicle suspension holistically. They look at touching everything, so all of their shocks are designed to kind of be paired with their springs and everything like that. Now, you can mix and match, but they've developed everything together, so we'll be speaking about these in the lens of their complete kits. You know, both OME and Dobinsons make a lot more than suspension, so a lot of these kits are optimized at least around a little constant load, made to handle a little constant load, or really are designed to be part of a full system from bumper to bumper. Now, although both of these shocks are very much optimized for similar levels of performance, similar use cases, they do go about things a little differently, especially at the spring department. Now, both ARB and Dobinsons are spring guys. They started off making springs first. So the biggest thing that you see between the two of these is how they spring them. Now, the OME is generally only available with one coil spring, and they do a lot of work to make sure that is a spring that will work both on loaded applications and unloaded and still be comfortable. A good example are like these Tacoma 4Runner BP-51s. Part number is different, but the spring is the same. They use a 13-inch, 650 pound per inch spring. Most other coilovers in this space, outstanding icons, use a 14-inch, 600 pound spring. So by going an inch shorter but 50 pounds per inch stiffer, that's something that can be set up whether you're at stock weight or you can just add preload as you add weight. On the Dobinson side of things, they get a lot more tricky on most applications. They're giving you a variety of spring options or giving you a spring that's designed to do most of the lift on its own, and then you can add preload later. We do think the Dobinson route is better because if you do have an application that requires a variety of springs to get it set up accordingly, they set that up for you. Right here is a Bronco spec shock, and they actually have springs for 2- and 4-door models. We'll set it up for 2.3 or 2.7 models, so you can really optimize the setup for the factory weight of your vehicle or the weight you add. The other thing is, on adjustment, the body design does make a big difference. In the case of the OME, they are a threaded body just like the Dobinsons, but because they're an aluminum body, you will need a spring compressor to make any sort of adjustments. Basically, having 650 pounds per inch forcing its way into the spring seat on the threads, you're just going to blow your threads up the second you try to make an adjustment unless you take load off of them. On the other side, Dobinsons uses a DOM steel body, which does mean they might be a little bit more prone to corrosion, although their coatings are great, so we haven't had an issue with that. But you can make at least small adjustments without a spring compressor with the shocks still installed on the vehicle, if of course it's a coilover. Now, just because the OMEs are only available with one spring rate as the coilover off the shelf doesn't mean you can't change it in the future. In fact, most of these coilovers use a 3-inch ID universal style coilover spring. So although it may not be a standard off-the-shelf spring you can buy to replace it with the same spring, there might be a spring rate that works to help with the load you might have. An example of that is on 200 series Land Cruisers. They use a dual rate spring on these so that as you basically at an unloaded vehicle, you're riding in the soft initial rate, and then you basically preload all of that initial rate out of the way to the stiffer rate if you want if you need a stiffer setup. Now, just because that's not a standard spring you can just go buy from Eibach or even OME, doesn't mean you can't snag a 16-inch, 700 pound per inch spring if you wanted to. In the case of the Dobinsons, invariably the majority of their springs aren't going to be a universal style coil spring because a lot of their coilovers are designed to mount to the factory style upper mounts. Like we were saying, Dobinsons has a ton of different spring options and they can go pretty stiff. Basically, if you can't find a rate that is stiff enough for the weight you have in your vehicle, it's probably because it exceeds how they can valve the shocks. They might be able to get you a spring for it, but chances are you got the wrong rig, bud. I think really the best way to compare these shocks is to go into their individual designs and the technologies within them. We'll start with the OME BP-51s because they're a little trickier, a little bit more advanced. They're an internal bypass design. They use almost an identical design to what Fox uses and ADS uses, where they use a sleeve inside the body that has bypass ports, holes cut into it, that allow flow around the main piston within the normal ride zone. So in the middle of the shock, oil is bypassing the main piston until it either compresses or extends out of that zone beyond those bypass ports, and then oil is forced through the stiff valving of the main piston. Simply, it just means in the normal ride zone where you're driving around most of the time, they can be super soft and compliant, and then provide progressive support when you hit something hard that causes you to bottom or top them out. This is a huge benefit, whereas traditional shocks that aren't position sensitive basically have a one-size-fits-all tune for their whole travel range. So they don't have as much of a dynamic response to different situations. That shock, a traditional non-position sensitive shock, is just as stiff over bumps that keep you in the first few inches of your travel as they are at the end of their travel, which means you just have to make some compromise somewhere. You can't have it as comfortable as you want it to get it, because when you hit something hard enough to make it bottom out, it's going to bottom out fast, and you can't make it as stiff as you would want to get it to keep it from bottoming out, because when you're just driving around on the street, it's going to ride terrible. Position sensitive shocks are mostly at benefits, but they're not without their drawbacks, and comes in the name, they're position sensitive. That means they're very sensitive about where they're set in terms of ride height. So on a separate spring and shock setup, so you're just getting the OME shocks, you'll notice compared to something like the Dobinsons or any other traditional shock, they'll have a shorter range of lift they're designed for. And on coilover applications, we often find that you should probably keep the adjustment tighter than what OME recommends. So let's say they say it's a 0 to 3 inch shock, it's probably better at 1 to 2. And that is because you want to keep that piston in the ride zone. You want to be in the meat of the ride zone. As you go out of that zone, you're not getting the benefits of a position sensitive shock. And in fact, it's going to be worse than something that isn't position sensitive, because you are in a ride zone that is designed for either bottoming out or topping out the shock. Simply put, you're in the stiff spot. Now, that also has a big factor on your adjusters. On these OME shocks, you get 10 settings of compression, 10 settings of rebound adjustment, and that rebound adjustment is stellar because the only other shocks we can think of at this price point that have it are these Dobinsons MRRs on this table. The problem with that comes with the position sensitive design. Position sensitive, those adjusters are only adjusting in that primary ride zone, so in the meat in the middle. That means if you are outside of that zone, those adjusters aren't doing anything for you, and they can only control stiffness within that zone. So if you are continuing to have issues where they're bottoming out or topping out a lot, you might be able to slow down the energy within the ride zone, but it's not going to do anything outside of it. So we do love these, and these can be some of the best riding shocks on the market if you can set them up at the lift height that they work best at. Otherwise, they could be your worst enemy real quick. And trust me, I heard myself. I just got done talking about how great position sensitive shocks are, but there are a lot of cases where something that isn't position sensitive, like this Dobinson MRR, is gonna be the way to go. The biggest reason, obviously, like we were saying, is if you want to set yourself up with a lift height that doesn't really match the OME BP-51s or doesn't set you in the middle of the ride zone, even without position sensitive dampening or anything to control, any additional control at either end of the suspension's travel, these OMEs will actually ride a lot better than these BP-51s. We found on our Tacoma that they just were not happy at the lift height we were at. They rode great, but they kind of topped out, felt harsh in situations, and as we dropped them, they rode better. On the other side, these Dobinsons would be far less affected by ride height because there's only one ride zone to worry about. Additionally, although most days you could be at a lift height where you might match the ride zone of the OME, if you're carrying a lot of variable load, that might cause enough sag to take you out of that ride zone and sit you in the bottom out zone, which might be too stiff for the weight you're carrying. On the Dobinsons, that's not going to be a problem. Essentially, since you only have that single ride zone, they can be compressed as you want them to be compressed. You can throw 1,000 pounds in your bed one day, pull 1,000 pounds out, and they're not going to be angry with you because they're at the wrong point in their travel. Being a more traditional damper design also means that their adjusters control the whole range of travel as well, unlike the BP-51s, which you're only getting that ride zone. On these, you're not just getting regular compression and rebound, you're getting low speed and high speed compression individually of each other, as well as rebound, whereas on the OME, that compression adjuster is just the whole curve. Whether it's body roll, brake dive, squat under throttle, bump stiffness, whatever, that adjuster on the OME does all of it. Now on the Dobinsons, you can use that low speed compression adjuster to help with handling, reduce body roll, brake dive, sway, stuff like that. Initial ride feel that don't work the shocks really hard, and then keep everything separate for most of your comfort on the high speed. You can also further optimize handling with rebound, and with the amount of different spring options they have, having that rebound adjustment is super nice because you can use rebound to control whatever spring rate you choose. Simply put, let's say you find yourself a little oversprung for at least the load you're driving with every day. That means you could come down on high speed and even low speed compression, come up on rebound, and you might have a similar feel to if you had the exact spring rate you needed. Now, you heard me talk about all these options with these Dobinsons. Maybe this isn't a setup for somebody who doesn't want to go do any thinking when they want to purchase, but obviously we can do all that thinking for you, help you make the decision, and help you set them up as well. In terms of actual construction, we'll get into the deep nitty-gritty details. The OME BP-51 comes with a 51 millimeter piston. It's in the name. They have to neck down piston size to that 2 inches from the 2.8 of the body because that piston has to sit in that internal bypass sleeve. Dobinsons does not have that same limitation. So on some applications like these Bronco coilovers you're looking at here, or on something like a full-size truck like a Tundra, you're gonna see a full-size 60 millimeter piston, which is on par with everything else at this price point. Now, I do believe this does mean you might be able to set up the Dobinsons to either handle super heavyweight or go fast off-road a little better, just simply because they have the potential for more dampening force than the BP-51. But once again, if you're looking for go fast shocks, these may not be the ones for you anyway. In terms of serviceability and of course reliability, both of these shocks are really similar, but I do think Dobinsons just takes the lead here. OME uses a metal on metal, basically a spherical bearing at the lower mount on most of their coilovers and shocks in the BP-51 line, which, although stronger than a traditional bushing, isn't going to last as long, and they usually use metric sizes that just straight up aren't available here in the US. We also haven't found a great way to get their seals without just sending the shock over to OME, so pretty much the only person who's going to be able to service these are ARB OME USA, although I imagine they rebuild just like any other internal bypass shock. On the other side, Dobinsons uses OE mounts top and bottom where they can. You'll see this Bronco rear coilover uses a conversion hat like these with natural rubber bushings, but on most applications like your Tacoma, 4Runner, whatever, will use your actual stock top hat even on the coilover. We can order their seals and their oil straight from Dobinsons, and just about anybody who could rebuild shocks can rebuild these. In terms of total life, I don't think 60, 70, 80,000 miles is out of the question for either of these, but you will probably have gone through a lower mount bearing on the OME before you would even need to worry about these Dobinsons. And when it's time, Dobinsons can take care of you, we can take care of you. Anybody who can get their seals can rebuild these, which isn't the case with the OMEs. So who are each of these shocks for? Well, I really think they could very well be just as good for the same person, but there are some situations where one might be better than the other. The OME is definitely a great set it and forget it shock. If the lift you're looking for matches the range they're designed for, the weight you're carrying works in that range too, they can be great and even in a lot of cases ride better than the MRR. But you're not going to want to have to try to get to these dampening adjusters again to readjust for something else that you're doing, and you certainly aren't going to want to have to take the coilover off to adjust preload again because they need a spring compressor to do that. On the other side, the Dobinsons are less concerned about lift height. They're not position sensitive, so they're not that sensitive about their position. So if you have an amount of constant weight or you're looking for a lift height that's outside of the range of the OME, these are the better option. They have more spring choices. They don't care if you're too low or too high, which is great for variable load. Another reason why they're killer for a wide range of uses as well is you can actually get to their adjusters fairly easily. They use a regular old dual knob design just like a Fox, and then on the lower mount they give you a little flathead screwdriver spot to adjust rebound, so you're not trying to fight with spanner wrenches like you are on the OMEs. So if you want a little bit more lift than these can give you, you might be carrying a wide variety of loads over the life of the vehicle. These Dobinsons are much easier to live with. You can get to the dampening adjusters much more easily. You can adjust preload without a spring compressor, not necessarily recommended, but you can get away with it. And with all the options available, it's easier to set these up for a more unique setup. Now, I don't think there's a wrong answer here. There might be a more right answer for you, but if you have questions about these or you need help getting them set up because it can be a little difficult with all these options, don't hesitate to leave us a comment, give us a shout on the website. We'd love to help you out. And in the meantime, we'll see you guys out on the trails.